Thanks again for joining. And I'd like to start with asking how you're doing, as well as is there anything from this situation that you're learning about yourself or just about life in general?
Yeah, lots about life in general, I think. What am I learning about myself? I think one thing that's definitely stood out to me is that it makes me realize I've really lost the art of a phone call. Like, I often put off seeing friends and family because I think it has to be this big event, and I kind of wait to see them and go out for dinner or go out for lunch or something. And a lot of them live far away, so we kind of put it off for ages and we don't catch up until we can see each other. And now this is making me be a lot better at just kind of picking up the phone or just having a quick sort of 20-minute chat on Zoom or something. And yeah, that's something I think that's one positive, something I'd like to take away from this afterwards, I think.
Awesome. By the way, my cat is meowing at me right now. So
Oh. I've had to shut the door because mine will be all over my lap if
she's been wanting a lot of attention recently.
Oh.
Cool. So we did get a question ahead of time. I know. Let me pick her up for a second.
She's gorgeous. What's she called?
Zaylee.
Oh.
So let me see. The question that you received ahead of time is, what is the most successful mechanism you've used to evangelize your design system?
Oh yeah, this one was sent to me. So I think the most successful thing for evangelizing a design system is other people. Like, I think that any kind of argument, any data or any like success metrics that you can pull out are not, in my experience, are not a match for people who feel a sense of kind of pride and ownership in the system. So for me, that's one of the reasons why I think contribution is really important to design systems, because what I've found is that when you help somebody to contribute to the system and feel that they've got kind of part of themselves in it or something that they can point to and feel proud about, that tends to, you're sort of inadvertently creating like a network of advocates. So I think other people are probably the most compelling thing that you have in your arsenal to help you promote your design system.
I would agree with that for sure. Awesome. We have a question from Daniel. Hi, Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
He asks, so design systems and organizational design, is there a link?
Definitely, I think. I mean, it's hard to, I don't think you can design a design system without careful attention to your organization's design. So I think that thinking about the context in which you're trying to build the system is really important. And it's definitely been interesting learning for me. Like, I've just moved company, and the organization where I was working before and the one that I'm working in now are very different, and the context is very different. And therefore, a lot of the things that I learned about design systems and a lot of the decisions that we made on the design system I worked on previously are not necessarily appropriate here, and we're having to kind of change things a lot because the organization is structured so differently and the culture is different. So yeah, I definitely think there's a relationship between organization design and design systems.
My cat's very loud.
The cat's like agreeing with me.
Yes.
The cat's like, that is an affirmative meow.
Yes. Because of all the times that she would come by.
Mine are all over my desk most of the time.
So I found at Salesforce when I was there, we worked very closely with the people that did any sort of design management or design operations. And often, even though we weren't the ones making the decision of the organizational structure, we it definitely felt like we had a lot of influence with that team that worked on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, we in our team now, we're working really closely with like the design operations team and the content operations lead, and I think that they're really important for helping us to kind of frame the design system and to make sure that it's adopted and understood and used in this context. So yeah, definitely.
So speaking of content, that's your background, right? Content and content strategy.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how you came into being involved with design systems?
Yeah, definitely. So my kind of route into design systems was, I think it's fair to say, like fairly accidental. My background was in kind of editorial content, and I worked for a publishing company that made kind of magazines and primarily focused on editorial content. And then for my last year there, I was working on more of a kind of product design side. And that was how I ended up going for a kind of more producty type role at the Government Digital Service, which is where I learned everything I know, I suppose, about design systems. So yeah, I joined GDS in, I think, about 2017, and my intention was to go there and be a content designer working on GovUK, which is like all the kind of guidance that the UK government gives for citizens and all the sort of information about policy and stuff like that. And then when I turned up, they didn't need me on that team, or there'd been some kind of miscommunication, and I was actually put onto this other team, which was producing guidance for civil servants. So rather than being kind of external facing, it was all the stuff that was looking at our kind of standards and assurance for people who work in government. And out of that grew the design system. So we already had some patterns and some components, but they were all quite disparate and they weren't brought together, and they weren't necessarily, there hadn't been a lot of thought about how to get those things into production. And so I started off working on the kind of very small project team, looking at how we might bring those things together and create more of a design system. And then that was how I sort of ended up in it. And and leading on the content side was really interesting. And certainly, like, when I joined, there weren't too many people who had content designers on their team, so it was definitely like an interesting challenge trying to kind of find my place in that space, where there didn't seem to be a lot of precedent for it. And there were certainly people who were thinking about content designy type things for design systems, but there didn't seem to be many sort of dedicated content people working in system teams. So yeah,
something that I wish we had when I was on the Lightning Design System team. We didn't have a content person at all, and it definitely was a struggle because we do our best with content, but I think it's good to always have somebody who really understands it to be on the team.
Yeah, I think I would obviously sort of advocate having a content designer, but I do think that content is one of those really interesting disciplines that does struggle to make its voice heard, because I think with lots of other disciplines, there's more of a sort of hard barrier to being involved. So like, I couldn't just start coding, I couldn't even necessarily just start working with design tools that I haven't used before. And so there's more of a kind of like a binary, like I can do it or I can't do it. And I know that it's not how it works, and those things are on a spectrum. But with content, most people can sort of physically access the tool. They can write, they can say words, they can and so I suppose it's one of the reasons why content is often seen as a luxury or a kind of nice to have. And I think until you've worked with one closely on something like a design system, it's hard to envision the sort of value that it adds. I hope it adds.
We did have a team. They called themselves the docs team because mostly they were involved with doc writing, but we tried to also engage them for UI copy.
Yeah.
We got some really interesting guidelines through that engagement, because things around when do you truncate, when do you not truncate.
Yeah,
there's so many interactions that actually can be driven by content.
Yeah, definitely. And it's I think it's two quite different skill sets. And it's actually, funnily enough, it was a conversation I was having today, because we've got a couple of content designers on our team now, and we're just trying to work out how to kind of divide the work up between them and where both of their strengths are. And I think that there's definitely a difference in that skill set involved in kind of writing documentation and maybe kind of designing the content that forms part of the system, compared with the skills that you need to think about content at a UI level and content that forms part of user journeys that might be part of what your system distributes. And yeah, talking about sort of truncation and stuff, we're currently getting into the world of localization. And so we're looking at how content can be localized and how we need to build components to support that localization. And it's so complicated. Like, I thought I understood content, and now I'm looking at this, and it's just it's a very sort of technical and yeah, like meaty subject matter. I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. We have another question. What is a productive approach for integrating QA when there is no people allocated specifically for this?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think, again, it's often one of those things that is not kind of allocated to a specific person. And I think that, I mean, personally, I think that QA is one of those things that it's helpful to democratize as far as you can, because I think that bringing people into the process of kind of assurance and understanding what good looks like and giving them ownership over those decisions is one of the ways that you can kind of involve people in the system, and that you can raise awareness of it. So I guess I would try to think about how we could first and foremost make that something that's shared within the team. So how can we invite members of the core design system sort of maintenance team to kind of take part in that process and to participate equally in it by maybe drawing on common standards and maybe defining those standards together. I do think this is again like a massive theme for me recently, is thinking about how QA differs for system level decisions versus product level decisions, and how important it is to kind of decouple those. So there's definitely I find like quite a strong push from different stakeholders within the business to treat QA as like one and the same, or like the process of product design and system design as the same thing. But actually, like, the framework that we might use to QA a system level decision would be completely different from the types of things we'd be asking ourselves for introducing stuff into a product. So I think decoupling those things is also quite critical. And yeah, thinking about how you might QA the application of design system components into a product, that's when I would maybe be thinking about trying to invite people outside of the team to participate in that and act as almost kind of champions or representatives of the design system within their teams. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you made a good point about the QA of the product versus the QA of the system can be very separate. That just sneezed. Two of the things I think that we did was we would do hack days using our system on other projects, and it would help surface issues that we could, prioritize to fix. Yeah. And of course, any automated like visual regression testing or linting and things like that we had in place would help try to cover, the low-hanging fruit issues to so we have, and thank you for asking all these questions, Daniel. Daniel asks also, is there a shared taxonomy for design system scope? For example, component interaction service.
Is there a shared taxonomy? So I guess I'm going to interpret that as, is there a universal taxonomy? And I would say no. I think that sometimes we talk as though there's like one way to define and document things within a design system. But from my experience, like, people can say the word pattern and mean very different things. And I think that the taxonomy that you design primarily just has to work for the organization that you're designing in. And again, that comes back to that relationship between organization design and system design. So no, I don't think that there's one kind of shared taxonomy. I think that there's overlaps, and there's definitely areas where they align, but I think that it has to be fairly kind of context specific. And if you're not designing for your users, then that's when things are going to break down. Like, this is definitely something I'm learning, because I've brought with me all these preconceptions about what patterns are and what components are, and how you kind of distinguish different types of pattern, and they just don't necessarily make sense to people here. They don't make sense to the way that they work at the organization that I'm working in now. So I think that kind of thing has to be quite contextual. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there, you will see some things that are kind of commonly practiced, but for the most part, every team that I've worked with is totally different.
Yeah.
You know, I try to bring what I learned from my time at Apple to Salesforce, and it just didn't work. And then I try to bring what I learned at Salesforce to my time at Amazon, didn't work.
Yeah.
It can change from team to team.
Yeah.
I will say there is a project I noticed called Open UI, but I think their goal is to look at what all the different design systems and CSS frameworks are doing, and kind of you know, the comparisons and all that. I'm not sure what their end goal of that is, but it's something that might be worth checking out.
Yeah, definitely. I think you just touched on a really interesting point there, which is when you, like, I suppose this is something that you get good at, like, with more experience and time, but transitioning from one design system to another, there's definitely a thing of having to abandon everything you know, and like, it's like to a frightening degree actually. And also then like trying to identify the bits of your knowledge which are applicable and your experience which are applicable. So I think that for me, you know, pretty much everything I learned about design systems was in the context of the WK design system. And so now working at the design system for Babylon Health, it's interesting to, I kind of came in with all these ideas, then had to abandon them all, and now I'm having to kind of bring some of them back in as I realize that some of the stuff that I learn is applicable here and is useful. But it's definitely been a bit of a kind of balancing act for the past few weeks.
This next question is, other than speed, what are the most significant difference for designing for a system and designing for a product?
So I think that experimentation is perhaps something that's quite different. I think that it's not just a case of speed, but I think at product level, you really need to be able to push the boundaries, and you need to be able to experiment with different approaches. And I would argue that for systems, you do need a kind of level of stability, so that you're not creating kind of disruptive systems that are constantly like interrupting your users with updates and changes, and kind of building trust, I suppose. So I think like agility is maybe a better word that ties speed and experimentation together. But I think that at a product level, you can be kind of much more sharply focused on your context and your users' needs, and therefore you can afford to kind of maybe switch and try different things. Whereas at a system, because you're trying to deal with this broader context, a lot of which is sometimes unknown, you do have to think more about creating things that can scale and things that are abstract enough and stable enough to be applicable in the different contexts that they're needed. So I think it's maybe we play it safer with systems, I think, than we need to with products.
That's an interesting, outlook on that. I guess because I've been on both sides of product design and systems design, it's hard for me to talk about the difference, because I'm the same person doing both, so I kind of treat both in similar ways. You know, still doing my user research, still doing my iteration, and you know, and basically my product design process, I would apply to systems design.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's kind of tricky for me to answer because it
Yeah.
all kind of merges together for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you mean. Like, and I certainly think that if we're thinking about like systems to system users, the process is largely the same, but thinking about this, where the stuff in the system will eventually end up.
Yeah.
For me, that's where the design maybe might be slightly different. And we might think more about like making things which are versatile and sort of broadly applicable.
I think one thing that just came to mind, one thing I would say became very different when I switched from the product design team to the systems design team is just lots more like meeting and helping other people than when I was doing mostly product design. It was I mean, you're still talking to people, but not at the same scale that you are when you're doing systems design. So that would be the major differences.
Yeah, definitely.
So Damon asks, what survey questions do you believe to be the most insightful of satisfaction with your DS?
Say that again. Which survey insights?
Yeah, what survey questions do you believe to be the most insightful of satisfaction with your design system?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I have to say, I haven't had too much experience of learning about design systems through surveys. I think normally the teams that I have worked in have focused more on sort of qualitative research. That said, we did do a really interesting piece of research when I was on the WK Design System my final year there about barriers to adoption and things that prevented people from using the design system. And now I'm racking my brains trying to think about some of the things that we asked, that we learned from. So I think I'm not going to be able to think of a specific question, but I do think that in general, like anything, it's a really difficult challenge trying to survey designers in any way, because they will like, it's a little bit like asking me to read content as a reader and not as a content designer. So I think when you're asking designers or engineers about design systems, it is very difficult for them to sort of step back and not propose solutions and to kind of talk organically about the needs that they have. So I would say that it's probably important to focus on questions which don't lead them into that path of kind of solution, like presenting solutions, and maybe distract them and, you know, kind of help them to think more organically about how they use the system, rather than like, so I certainly wouldn't ask questions like how, anything explicit, like, you know, how satisfied are you with the system, how easy do you find the system to use, or anything like that, because I just don't think you're going to get, like, you are going to get so much opinion in those answers. And I think actually I would think more about questions around sort of task completion or stuff which is more objective, I guess. Yeah, that's a really tricky one. I don't think I think when we've done quantitative research or anything around, like anything using surveys, it's always been as a route into more qualitative research. And for me, I think that's where you always get the really interesting findings.
I did see a survey get abused for the wrong reason. We were having this debate on what to call the components that we were documenting. And the reason for that was, so in the world of Salesforce, the concept of lightning components is a actual thing that exists outside of the design system. Like the production framework that they're building already existed. And so those are components. So I didn't really want to call what we had components because people would get those things confused. And we weren't really doing fully baked components. There was no JavaScript. They were simply really specs. Like, it's like, here's the ideal markup and style that you need. And then what we would document, here's what you would need to make it work JavaScript-wise. And the reason was because we had so many different people from all sorts of different technology stacks using our system that we couldn't really deliver JavaScript because it might not work with if they're on React or if they're on Java or if they're on, whatever it is that they're on. So the person who was kind of a leader over me was very adamant that he thought they should be called components. And I was like, I think that's going to get confused. So he sent out a survey to the entire engineering org with zero context. He just said, which do you prefer? Components, this, or this?
Oh, no.
Of course, everybody picked components. And so he's like, see? And I'm like, but you gave them no context what the survey was about. So I lost the argument. It got called components, and sure enough, everybody got confused. And so now at the site, and this change happened after I left, I noticed they now call them component blueprints. And I'm just like,
interesting. Yeah. I think, and that's exactly that's such a good example of how surveys can be so flawed sometimes, or how research can be so flawed. It's the equivalent for content is you put a piece of guidance in front of somebody and you say does this make sense to you? Is this useful? And people will just default to yes. It's the easiest answer to do. And so I think that actually kind of finding ways to think about making the research realistic is really important. And and that certainly doesn't sound like a realistic way to get a decision on that.
Yeah. So it looks like we're coming up on our time. One thing I like to ask everybody is there anything coming up for you that we can look out for, as well as, actually, we did get a question real quick. Let me ask that one, and then I'll come back to mine. Worst moment while designing a system?
Oh, God. Worst moment. I think I'm allowed to talk about this. And if I'm not, then we'll find out. It's fine. Yeah. So when I worked on the WK design system in the UK government, they have this kind of 4-stage service assessment process. So if you're designing a new service, whether that's a design system or a service for the public or whatever it is, you go through this 4-step process, and you go through alpha, beta, and then into live. And we had an alpha assessment, and we had prepared really hard for it. We'd done loads of research. It was months worth of work. And I think it's fair to say we were quite confident that, this was all going to be okay. And actually we were assessed by a very scrupulous panel who failed us. And I think probably the day that I found out that we had failed our assessment was my worst day, because this was quite a critical assessment. It was the one that stopped us from, the one that would have enabled us to be able to go live with the design system and actually to release it to people. And and we got this huge long list of remedial actions that we had to take that was definitely a low point. I remember I think there might have been literal tears. It wasn't a good day. So I think that was probably my worst moment. But it turned out well in the end. We spent 6 weeks addressing all the things, and I have to admit it was probably better for it in the end. So I live to tell the tale. How about you? Do you know?
I'm trying to think of one. I mean, there were, there's always going to be some ups and downs. I'm just not sure which one would be considered the worst. I guess, I'll just be very candid, but we had a lot of new leadership coming into our organization, and a lot of them came to the organization because they were attracted to the design system, and they were like, this design system is kind of famous, we want to be involved. They joined the organization and basically try to take over, because now they want to shake things up and make their mark. And so a lot of the things that I owned basically was taken away from me, and that sucked.
Yeah,
I would say that's probably the worst.
Yeah, that does kind of suck.
Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, we get very attached to our systems, I think. Yeah.
All right, so my last question for you is there anything coming up that we can look out for, as well as ways that the community can support you?
Oh, that's a good one. What's coming up to look out for? So I don't actually know if I'm allowed to say this yet, but I am going to be doing a remote conference in the summer. and I will post details about that as soon as I'm allowed to. So you can support me by buying a ticket to that when it's available. And aside from that, I don't think so. I think I'm doing okay.
Awesome. My cat wants me to finish anyway.
Oh, well,
thank you so much.
No, it was great to talk to you and your cat.
Yeah, thanks for everyone that joined today.
All right.
Have a
Thank
good rest
you.
of your evening.
Bye.
Bye.